You can hear the drinking horns before you see the hall. The sound echoes across the fjord, laughter, the clash of wood against wood, voices thick with mead and victory. Inside, firelight throws wild shadows against timber walls. Men are telling the story of the battle again, each retelling louder than the last. But in the corner, near the low door that leads to the sleeping quarters, there's a different sound, quieter. A woman's breath catching in her throat. She's wearing a torn silk dress that once marked her as someone's daughter, someone's sister. She doesn't speak their language yet. She doesn't need to. She already understands what comes next. This is the moment after the saga ends, after the skalds stop singing. This is where the real story begins, the one they didn't write down because it was happening in every conquered hall, in every captured city, from the Irish coast to the rivers of the Rus, and it's about to get darker than you think. Before we step into that darkness together, I have to tell you something. It genuinely amazes me that you're here, watching this, whether you're in Snow, Palo, or Stockholm, or somewhere I've never heard of. Drop a comment and let me know where this story is reaching you tonight. It helps more than you know. The year is 845, and the Seine is choked with longships. Paris, the jewel of the Frankish Empire, sits behind walls that have never fallen. Inside those walls are not just merchants and monks, but the daughters of counts, the wives of magistrates. Women who've lived their entire lives in stone comfort, who've never gone hungry, never known what it means to be powerless. That's about to change in a way their worst nightmares couldn't predict. The Viking leader, a man named Ragnarius, possibly that Ragnar, though the chronicles are frustratingly vague, has brought 120 ships and 5,000 men up the river. King Charles the Bald has fled. The city's defenders are dying of plague inside the walls, and Ragnar knows exactly what he's doing. He's not just here for gold. Gold is heavy. Gold has to be carried. But people carry themselves. And in the markets of Hiddeby, Dublin, and Birka, a healthy noblewoman is worth more than her weight in silver, not just for the ransom, but for what she represents. Control, humiliation, the complete inversion of the social order. When Paris finally opens its gates, it's not surrender, it's negotiation. Charles pays 7,000 pounds of silver, but the chronicles, the Annals of St. Bertin, written by Bishop Prudentius, who was there, they mention something else in careful Latin. Plurimus captivus abduxerant. They took away very many captives. The number isn't recorded. The names aren't given. But we know from other sources what happened to women like this. Some were kept by the raiders themselves, distributed as concubines to men who'd proven themselves in battle. Others were taken to the great slave markets. And here's where it gets specific, where the merchant ledgers and port records fill in what the chronicles won't say. In Hiddeby, the largest Viking trading hub, archaeologists have found price tablets, thin strips of wood with runic markings that list trade values from the 9th century. A male thrall, a field slave, was worth 8 to 12 ounces of silver. A young woman with skills suited to a household, their words, not mine, was worth 16 to 24 ounces. But a woman of obvious noble bearing, still young, who could be taught Norse and displayed as a status symbol. The price could go as high as 36 ounces, 3 full marks of silver. That's the price of 3 war horses or a small coastal trading ship. But here's what the price lists don't tell you. What you have to read between the lines of the sagas to understand. These women had a choice that wasn't a choice at all. They could resist, which meant immediate brutality and being sold to the lowest bidder, someone who needed labor more than status. Or they could adapt, which meant a slower kind of erasure, learning the language, converting to the Norse gods, or at least pretending to, bearing children who would never know their mother's true lineage, becoming a living ghost of the person they used to be. The Icelandic sagas, written 200 years later, but based on oral traditions, preserve a few of these stories. And they're more disturbing than any chronicle because they're told from the Norse perspective, as if this was all perfectly normal. There's a saga called Laxdela that tells of a woman named Melkorka. The saga claims she was the daughter of an Irish king named Meir Kjartan. Scholars think this might be Muirchertach, a real king of the Uaneil dynasty in the mid-10th century. Melkorka was captured in a raid, probably around 960, and sold in Norway to an Icelandic chieftain named Höskuldr. He paid 3 marks of silver for Haran, astronomical sum because she was beautiful and carried herself like royalty. But here's the detail that haunts me. The saga says she refused to speak for years. Not that she couldn't speak, nor she deliberately stayed silent. Höskuldr thought he'd bought a mute. She served in his household, bore him a son named Olaf, and said nothing. Not during childbirth. Not when her son learned to walk. Nothing. Until one day, Höskuldr was out walking and heard a voice near the stream. It was Melkorka speaking to her son in Irish, teaching him words from a language he'd never heard, telling him in secret that his grandfather was a king. When Höskuldr confronted her, the whole story came out. And you know what changed? Almost nothing. She wasn't freed. She was just acknowledged. Her son, Olaf, would grow up to be a powerful chieftain, they called him. Olaf the Peacock, because he dressed so splendidly, and he eventually sailed to Ireland, met his grandfather, and was recognized as Irish royalty. But Melkorka never saw Ireland again. She died in Iceland, thousands of miles from home, her silence finally broken, but her freedom never restored. That's one story. One woman. One name preserved by accident, because her son became important. But for every Melkorka whose story survived, there were hundreds whose names dissolved into the North Atlantic fog. And some of them made choices so extreme, so desperate, that they became legends for entirely different reasons. In the year 870, the great heathen army, the massive Viking force that had been systematically conquering England since 865, turned its attention to Scotland. One of their targets was a monastery called Coldingham, perched on a cliff overlooking the North Sea. It was a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns, and it was led by an abbess named Gibi the Younger. We don't know much about her life before this moment, but we know everything about how she chose to face her death, because Gibi knew what happened to nuns when monasteries fell. The chronicles are full of its Anne Cuthbert's monastery, Lindisfarne, where the nuns were raped before being taken as slaves. Iona, where the same thing happened. This wasn't battle. This was systematic. So when Gbe saw the Viking army approaching, she gathered her sisters in the chapter house. And according to the chronicler Matthew Paris, writing 300 years later, but drawing on earlier now-lost accounts, she did something that seems impossible until you understand the logic behind it. She took a razor, probably used for shaving tonsures, and cut off her own nose and upper lip. Just sliced them away. Then she told her nuns to do the same. The Latin phrase Paris uses is ut vobis, horribles officiatus, make yourselves horrible. One by one, they mutilated their own faces. Some sources say they used hot coals as well, burning their cheeks and foreheads. When the Vikings finally broke through the monastery's defenses and burst into the chapter house, expecting terrified victims, they found something else entirely. A room full of women with destroyed faces, standing in silent witness to what they would rather do to themselves than let it be done to them. The Vikings, according to the chronicle, were so enraged by being denied their prize that they burned the monastery to the ground with everyone inside. Gbe and her sisters died in the flames. But they died on their own terms, having transformed their bodies into weapons of defiance. Having chosen one kind of obliteration over another, the ruins of Coldingham were excavated in the 19th century. And they found a layer of ash and charcoal from that exact period, mixed with bone fragments. The story was real. And here's what gets me about it. The Christian chroniclers who recorded this presented it as a miracle of virtue, a triumph of chastity over lust, but that framing almost misses the point. This wasn't about purity. This was about control. The only control they had left was over their own flesh, and they exercised it absolutely. They made themselves unsellable, unusable, unmarketable. They broke the economic logic that turned women into commodities. And for that, they were erased. But not every woman had the option GBE chose. Some were too valuable, too politically important. In 1011, a Danish army under Thorkel the Tall laid siege to Canterbury, the spiritual heart of England. When the city fell after 20 days betrayed from within, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us the Vikings captured Archbishop Lefaya, the Bishop of Rochester, the abbess of a nearby convent, and several noble women of the Kentish aristocracy. These weren't random captives. They were hostages, bargaining chips in a negotiation that would decide the fate of England itself. The Vikings held them for 7 months. During that time, Lefaya refused to allow ransom to be paid for him, saying the church's money belonged to the poor. In April 1012, at a drunken feast in Greenwich, the frustrated Vikings pelted him with cattle bones and the heads of dead animals. And finally, one of them, a man who'd recently converted to Christianity and was apparently trying to end Lefaya's suffering, killed him with an axe blow. The archbishop became a martyr. His bones were enshrined. His story was told forever. But the women? Their names appear once in the Chronicle, and they took the abbess and certain women and then vanish. We know they were eventually released because the following year, King Theodred paid £48,000 of silver to Thorkel's army to leave England. That's one of the largest Danegeld payments ever recorded. And buried somewhere in that enormous sum was the price of those women's freedom. They weren't killed. They weren't martyred. They were returned, presumably, to their families. But what does that mean? 7 months in captivity. 7 months of whatever happened in those Viking camps on the Thames. And then they came home to a society that had no framework for processing that trauma, that would have expected them to be grateful for their release and silent about everything else. The Chronicles tell us nothing more. They returned to invisibility, carrying experiences that couldn't be spoken, living the rest of their lives as survivors of something history refused to name. And then there are the ones who never came home at all, who became part of something new, whether they wanted to or not. When Iceland was settled in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the Norse colonizers brought their families. That's the traditional story. Brave explorers seeking freedom from Norway's increasingly centralized monarchy, building a new republic in the volcanic north. But the Land of Mobach, the Book of Settlements, tells a more complicated story if you read it carefully. It lists the first settlers and where they came from. And over, it mentions Irish and Scottish concubines, women with names like Defniel and Svea Bolsdottir, women explicitly described as taken in war or captured in the West. These weren't volunteers. They were the foundation of Iceland's population. Modern DNA studies confirm it. While Icelandic men have predominantly Norse white chromosome ancestry, tracing their paternal lines back to Scandinavia. Over 60% of Icelandic women have mitochondrial DNA from the British Isles and Ireland. The math is stark. For every family farm in early Iceland, there was likely a woman who'd been taken from a burning village or a raided monastery, who'd crossed the North Atlantic in the hold of a ship, who'd given birth to children who'd never know her homeland. She became Icelandic, not by choice, but by capture. And her descendants, the modern Icelandic people, carry that history in their cells, whether they acknowledge it or not. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the structure. The entire Viking expansion, the settlements in Ireland, the Donau in England, the trading posts along the Russian rivers, even the temporary colonies in North America, all of it was built on a foundation of enslaved and captured women whose labor, odies, and reproductive capacity made these ventures possible. The sagas celebrate the men who founded farms and commanded ships. But the women who made those farms viable, who processed the wool and cooked the food and raised the children and kept the whole fragile enterprise alive through brutal winters. Their scenery, background, mentioned in passing, if they're mentioned at all. There's one more story I need to tell you. And it's the strangest one because we only know it through archaeology, through objects that outlasted the words. In 1904, archaeologists excavating a burial mound near Oslo, Norway, found the Oseberg ship, one of the most spectacular Viking finds ever discovered. It was a floating Tuma 21-meter longship, buried with 2 women, surrounded by unbelievable wealth, ornate sledges, carved wagon, tapestries, the remains of 15 horses and 6 dogs, everything needed for the afterlife. One of the women was elderly, around 70 to 80 years old, her bones showing advanced cancer. She was almost certainly the queen or a Volva, a powerful seer priestess. The other woman was younger, about 50. For decades, scholars assumed she was a servant who chose to follow her mistress into death, a loyal companion. But when DNA analysis became possible in the 21st century, the results told a different story. The younger woman's mitochondrial DNA showed a haplogroup U7 that's extremely rare in Scandinavia. It's most common around the Black Sea and the Caucasus. She wasn't Norse. She was from somewhere far to the east. It's probably brought to Norway through the same trade routes that carried silver, amber, and slaves between Scandinavia and Byzantium. Her bone isotopes showed that late in her life, her diet had changed dramatically: more meat, more protein, the diet of the Norse elite. She'd been someone else before she came here. And when the powerful woman she served died, she was buried with her. Maybe willingly, as an honored servant. Or maybe because in that culture, she was still property, and property gets buried with its owner. We'll never know her name. We'll never know what she thought in those final moments. But she's there, in that spectacular ship tomb, her bones testifying to a life that crossed continents involuntarily and ended beneath Norwegian soil. The Viking Age didn't really end. It echoed forward. Officially closing around 1066, its consequences lingered in DNA, half-noted records, and telling silences. Sagas hint at events they refuse to name. Later documents casually mention Irish women or Scottish concubines, never asking how they arrived there. This wasn't unique to Vikings. Romans, Mongols, and colonial empires followed the same pattern. But Vikings left just enough evidence to expose the process. Women captured, commodified, erased, then reduced to genetic traces. History forgets them layer by layer, deliberately, efficiently. There's a mass grave in Dorset, England, found by construction workers in 2009. It contains the skeletons of 54 young men, all of them Vikings, all executed around the year 1000. Their heads were cut off and piled separately. Isotope analysis of their teeth showed they came from all over Scandinavia, from north of the Arctic Circle. It was a brutal act of local resistance, Anglo-Saxons finally striking back after decades of raids. And when it was discovered, it made international news. Viking warriors massacred. We gave them names in museum exhibits. We studied their bones. We told their story. But here's what the chronicles of that same period also record. Hundreds of entries about women captured, carried off, taken to markets. No names, no bones in labeled graves. Just the phrases repeated over and over, and they took many women into captivity. For every grave of Viking men we excavate and memorialize, there are dozens of women who vanished into a system that was designed to erase them. Their value was calculated, their lives were stolen. And then they were forgotten with such thoroughness that we're still uncovering the fact that they existed at all. So when you see the feasting hall in the movies, when you hear the drinking songs and watch the heroes toast their victories, remember what's happening just off camera. In the corner, by the door. In the ship's hold. In the slave market. In the farmhouse in Iceland, where a woman is teaching her son words from a language she's not supposed to speak anymore. That's where the story continues. That's where it's always been happening. And the only reason we know anything at all is because some of them, like Melora, like GBE, like the unnamed woman in the Oseberg ship, left traces that were too stubborn to erase completely. Fragments of silk, strands of DNA, stories whispered just loudly enough to survive. They're still speaking, if you know where to listen. And the silence around them is louder than any saga.